There is a specific kind of exhaustion that belongs exclusively to the person who has always been the one to reach first. Who has sent the first message, made the first move, restarted the conversation after every silence, returned after every withdrawal with enough warmth to cover the distance that the other person created? Who has, over the course of weeks or months or sometimes years, functioned as the sole engine of a connection that required two people to sustain it, but seemed to run only when one of them was willing to keep pushing? You know this exhaustion. It lives in a particular place. Not quite sadness, not quite anger. Somewhere in the territory between the two where resignation quietly takes root. And the question underneath it, the one that never fully goes away no matter how many times you have tried to reason yourself out of it, is the one that this entire conversation is about. Why will they not just reach first? Why, when everything between you feels real and the connection is genuine and you can see in their eyes and hear in their voice that you matter to them, do they still wait, still hold back, still leave the initiating to you as though the vulnerability of going first is a cost they simply cannot bring themselves to pay? The answer is not what most people expect. And understanding it, really understanding it, at the level where the psychology becomes undeniable, changes not just how you see them, but how you move. And how you move is, as it turns out, everything. The first thing that needs to be established is what avoidant non-initiation actually is, because it is almost universally misread. And the misreading is costly. Not just emotionally, though it is costly there too. It is costly in terms of the decisions it leads to, the conclusions it produces, the story it writes about what the connection means and whether the feeling is mutual, and whether the whole thing is worth continuing to invest in. Non-initiation in an avoidant is not indifference wearing the neutral expression. It is not the behavioral evidence of someone who could take or leave the connection, and simply defaults to leaving it because taking it requires effort they do not feel motivated to expend. It is not laziness or selfishness in the ordinary sense of those words, though it produces outcomes that can be genuinely difficult to distinguish from both. What avoidant non-initiation actually is, at its psychological root, is the endpoint of a fear calculation that happens so fast and so automatically that the avoidant themselves is often not fully aware it is occurring. The moment the impulse to initiate arises, and it does arise regularly, for avoidants who genuinely feel something for the person they are with, it runs immediately through a filter built from years of relational experience and early attachment conditioning. And that filter asks, in the language of the nervous system rather than words, a question that sounds something like this: if I reach, what will it cost me? The cost the filter is calculating is not the obvious cost of rejection, though that is part of it. The deeper cost it is measuring is the cost of need made visible, of want expressed openly, of the specific vulnerability of being the one who went first, who showed their hand, who made their caring legible in a way that cannot be taken back. For someone whose entire psychological architecture was built around the project of never being caught needing, never being exposed as dependent, never giving another person the kind of leverage that open emotional expression provides, this cost registers as prohibitive. Every time. Even when the feeling behind the impulse is genuine and significant, and everything in them wants to close the distance, the impulse to initiate gets swallowed. The reaching pulls back before it becomes visible. The wanting goes underground, back into the private interior where all of the avoidance' most real feeling lives, and the outside remains still and composed and apparently unaffected. And you, waiting on the other side of that stillness for a sign that you are not alone in caring about this, receive nothing, and the story writes itself in the absence of information the way stories always do. And the story is usually wrong. So what actually makes an avoidant initiate? What shifts the calculation? What changes the internal cost-benefit analysis enough that the reaching finally makes it past the filter and becomes action rather than suppressed impulse? The answer has several layers, and each layer is more important than the one before it. Starting with the most surface level and working toward the most foundational is the only way to do the answer justice. The most surface level layer is about perceived safety in the specific immediate context of the potential initiation. Avoidants are dramatically more likely to initiate when the conditions of the interaction feel low stakes. When there is a plausible deniability available, a reason to make contact that is not explicitly emotional, a topic or a question or a reference to something shared that provides cover for the reaching without requiring the reaching to announce itself as reaching. A funny observation. a reference to something they know you care about, a question that is genuinely curious rather than emotionally weighted. This is not the avoidant being cowardly, though it can look that way from the outside. It is the avoidant finding the door in the wall that is narrow enough to fit through without the full exposure of walking through the main entrance. The side door is still a door. The reaching, however it is dressed, is still reaching. And understanding this, recognizing the low-stakes contact as the avoidance version of going first, rather than dismissing it as insufficient because it did not arrive as the full, emotionally explicit declaration you are hoping for, is one of the most important reframes available in this dynamic. The second layer is about history, about the specific relational history between you and the avoidant, and what that history has taught them about what happens when they take the lead. Avoidants who have initiated in the past, who have, at some earlier point in the dynamic, reached first or expressed feeling directly or made their interest explicit, have almost universally had that initiation met with a response that, however well-intentioned, confirmed their fear about what opening costs. Not necessarily a bad response, often a genuinely warm and happy response, but a response that arrived with a weight of expectation in it, with the implicit or explicit message that this opening should be followed by more opening, that the initiation was evidence of a capacity for emotional availability that should now be consistently available, that the door they cracked should now be held open permanently. For an avoidant, this response, even when it comes from a place of genuine love and entirely reasonable relational expectation, is the confirmation of everything the filter was calculating. Opening led to being asked to stay open. Reaching led to being held in the reaching position indefinitely. The initiation, rather than being received as the thing it was, a significant, costly, vulnerable act by someone for whom the act is genuinely difficult, was used as evidence for a new standard that felt impossible to sustain. And so they learned from that history that initiating raises the bar, that going first does not produce the relief of connection, it produces the pressure of expectation. And so the filter gets stricter. The calculation tilts further toward not reaching, and the non-initiation that looks from the outside like not caring enough is actually the scar tissue from having cared enough to try and finding the trying came with consequences they could not manage. Understanding this history and responding to avoidant initiation differently when it does occur is one of the most direct and practical things you can do to shift the pattern. When they reach, however, the reach arrives and whatever door it comes through, receive it without immediately converting it into evidence for a new standard. Receive it as exactly what it is. A significant act by someone for whom it is significantly difficult. Let it land and breathe and be sufficient for the moment, without the moment becoming a lever for more. This response, the response that receives without requiring, teaches the avoidance nervous system something its history never has. That going first does not automatically raise the cost of going first again. That the door, when opened, does not immediately become a demand. That reaching is safe in the specific foundational sense that it will not immediately be used against them. The third layer is where the conversation deepens into something that most discussions of avoidant initiation never adequately address. Because the first two layers are about the avoidant, about their fear calculation, about their history, about the conditions that make initiation feel more or less possible for them. The third layer is about you, specifically about what you are communicating through your behavior, your presence, your implicit relational stance, about what initiation from them would mean, about what the dynamic has been teaching them, interaction after interaction, about whether going first is something they are invited into or something they are being waited for. Here is the truth that is uncomfortable and important simultaneously. When you consistently initiate, when the pattern of the connection is reliably that you reach and they respond, you are, without intending to, removing the conditions under which avoidant initiation becomes necessary. You are solving the problem before it has a chance to create the mild productive discomfort of uncertainty that makes reaching feel like the right move. You are, in the language of behavior you want to see, by making the behavior unnecessary. This is not your fault. This is what happens when a person who genuinely cares about a connection and does not want to lose it responds to the avoidance non-initiation by initiating again. It is the logical, loving, entirely understandable response to a silence that feels like a gap you need to close. And it is the response that perpetuates the pattern most efficiently. What changes the pattern is not initiating less in a calculated strategic way. It is initiating less because you have genuinely, honestly shifted your relationship to the outcome. Because you have arrived at a place, through whatever combination of insight and exhaustion and self-respect, where the question of whether they will reach first has become less urgent than the question of how you are doing, what your own life looks and feels like, whether your own needs are being met by the full context of your existence, rather than being staked entirely on the behavior of one person who has demonstrated a specific and consistent limitation around emotional initiation. When this shift is genuine, when the reduction in your initiating comes from actual self-reorientation rather than strategic withholding, the dynamic changes in ways that are not always immediate, but are almost always significant. Because the thing that was making initiation unnecessary for the avoidant has been removed, the gap that you were reliably closing now remains open. And the open gap does something to the avoidant's interior experience of the connection that your filling it never could. It creates the specific, low-level, almost imperceptible uncertainty that avoidant desire requires to activate fully. Not the dramatic uncertainty of not knowing whether you care or whether the connection is real. The subtle uncertainty of not knowing exactly where things stand right now, in this moment, in this specific window of time. The uncertainty of a connection that is real and significant and not guaranteed to stay in its current configuration without some input from both people. That uncertainty, held at the right level, present enough to activate but not so intense as to confirm the avoidant's worst fears about what closeness costs, is the condition under which the impulse to initiate finally outweighs the filter. Where the cost of not reaching begins to register as greater than the cost of reaching. Where the calculation shifts. The fourth layer is about identity, about what you are communicating, through the totality of how you show up in the dynamic, about who you are in relation to this connection. Avoidants initiate toward people they experience as genuinely separate, as having a full existence that does not orbit around the connection between you, as being, in the most essential relational sense, someone who is living their own life and offering access to that life, rather than waiting for the avoidant's participation to make it worth living. The reason this matters so specifically for initiation is rooted in the avoidance fear architecture. Remember that what makes initiating feel costly is the vulnerability of making your wanting visible. The fear of having your hand shown, the specific exposure of being the one who went first, and therefore the one who cared more, or appeared to care more, or gave the other person leverage that an asymmetry of caring always creates. When you are someone who is clearly, visibly, genuinely living a full life regardless of the dynamic's temperature, the asymmetry that the avoidant fears becomes less charged. Because you are not waiting, because your life is not on hold pending their initiation, because the gap between your caring and theirs, the gap that reaching first makes visible, is less threatening when the person being reached for is clearly not sitting in suspended animation, waiting to be chosen. Paradoxically, it is easier for an avoidant to show they care about you when you are least obviously available to receive that caring. Not because they are contrarian or perverse. Because the visibility of your own fullness reduces the stakes of their reaching in the specific way their nervous system requires. It makes going first feel less like an exposure and more like an addition. Less like handing over leverage and more like contributing to something that already has its own momentum. The fifth layer addresses something that is rarely discussed directly in the context of avoidant initiation, and it is one of the most practically important things in this entire conversation. The role of appreciation without dependence. Most avoidants have a complicated relationship with feeling appreciated. On one level, they want it. The same fundamental human need for acknowledgement and recognition that everyone carries exists in them, however well defended against. On another level, expressed appreciation from the person they are with carries a subtle threat. Because appreciation, in the relational context they are most familiar with, tends to arrive bundled with expectation. I appreciate when you do this, delivered in the tone of someone who is also communicating please keep doing this, functions less as genuine acknowledgement and more as pressure wearing a grateful expression. When you express genuine appreciation for their reaching, when they do initiate, however tentatively or obliquely, in a way that is clean and warm and unencumbered by the weight of expectation, you are offering something their nervous system does not know how to anticipate. Appreciation that asks for nothing, that says this was good and enjoyable and I valued it, without the subtext of, and therefore I need you to make it the new normal. This kind of appreciation is one of the most direct positive reinforcements available for avoidant initiation, not in the mechanical behavioral conditioning sense, not as a deliberate technique designed to produce more initiation through reward, as the natural, honest response of someone who genuinely valued the contact and is expressing that value without converting it into a demand for more contact. The expression is real. The warmth is genuine, and it teaches the avoidance nervous system, gradually and against significant historical evidence, that going first produces something good and does not immediately produce the pressure that has always made good things feel dangerous. The sixth layer is about the quality of presence you bring to the interactions you do have. Because initiation does not happen in a vacuum, it is not a behavior that exists independently of the texture of the relationship between initiations. It is the product of cumulative experience, of what the avoidant has been feeling in the connection overall, of whether the interactions have been leaving them more open or more defended, more drawn toward, or more managed against. The interactions that produce the impulse to initiate are the ones that end with the avoidant feeling genuinely more alive for having had them, not just pleasantly occupied. Genuinely more themselves, more interested, more engaged with their own thinking and feeling than they were before the conversation happened. Interactions that reveal something about you they did not know, that open a perspective they had not considered, that carry the specific quality of two people who are actually meeting each other rather than performing a dynamic. These interactions are not produced by trying harder. They are not the result of being more entertaining or more interesting or more strategically engaging. They are the natural product of being genuinely present, of showing up to the conversation with your actual attention, your actual curiosity, your actual perspective, rather than with the managed monitoring quality of someone who is tracking the interaction's temperature and adjusting their behavior accordingly. Genuine presence has a quality that people, and particularly avoidants, whose nervous systems are finely tuned to detect the difference between real engagement and performed engagement, can feel immediately. It has a different texture, a different energy. It is not trying to produce a particular outcome in the other person. It is simply interested, simply here, simply itself. And that quality, more than any specific conversational technique, is what leaves an avoidant in the aftermath of an interaction with the specific, warm, quietly urgent sense of wanting more. That wanting more is the seed of initiation. It is the felt sense in them that there is something here worth returning to, worth reaching toward, worth the cost of going first, because the thing being reached for is genuinely, specifically, irreplaceably worth it. The seventh layer addresses the specific moment of the impulse, the precise internal experience of an avoidant in the seconds between thinking about reaching out and either doing it or suppressing it. Because that window, brief, often unconscious, enormously consequential, is where everything is decided. And understanding what happens in that window illuminates what changes it. In the window, two things are happening simultaneously. The wanting, which is genuine and specific and has a particular direction, towards you, toward the thought of you, toward the connection that exists between you and that their interior experience has been returning to with an increasing frequency they may not be comfortable acknowledging. And the filter, which is automatic and fast and loaded with the entire weight of the avoidance relational history and what that history has taught them about what wanting costs. Most of the time, the filter wins, because it is faster than the wanting, because it has more historical evidence on its side, because the relational environment has not yet provided sufficient counter-evidence to change the default setting. What changes the default setting, what slows the filter down enough for the wanting to make it through, is accumulated counter-evidence, interaction after interaction that delivered something different from what the filter predicted. That demonstrated, in the lived and embodied way that nervous systems require, rather than the intellectual way that minds can process independently, that reaching toward you produces something that does not confirm the fear. That the cost the filter has been calculating is not the cost that actually arrives. This counter-evidence is built slowly. It cannot be rushed or manufactured. It accumulates through the consistent delivery of the things described throughout this conversation. The receiving without requiring, the appreciation without dependence, the genuine presence, the full life that does not orbit around them, the standards communicated through being rather than declaration. Each of these things, repeated over time, is a data point that the nervous system files against the filter's historical evidence, and when the counter-evidence accumulates enough weight, the filter's dominance weakens. The wanting makes it through more often. The impulse to initiate becomes, incrementally, more likely to become action. The eighth layer is perhaps the most important one, and it is the one that requires the most honesty, because it asks something of you that goes beyond understanding the avoidance psychology or adjusting your communication, or building the conditions that make initiation more likely. It asks you to genuinely reckon with the question of what you need, not what you can work with. Not what is understandable given their history, what you actually need from a relationship in order to feel adequately valued, adequately seen, adequately chosen, on a consistent enough basis to be sustainable. Because here is the truth that the entire conversation has been building toward, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Avoidants can learn to initiate more. The pattern is not fixed, the architecture is not immutable. With the right conditions, with their own genuine engagement with the work of understanding and interrupting their patterns, with a relational environment that makes going first feel possible rather than prohibitive, they can become people who reach, who lead, who show up in the proactive, self-directed, you matter enough for me to go first way that healthy relationships require. But the conditions required for that shift to occur take time to build, and the time it takes is real time, during which you are in the dynamic, experiencing whatever the current version of the dynamic is delivering, during which your own needs are either being met or not being met, during which the question of whether this is sustainable is not a theoretical future question, but a present, lived, daily one. You are not required to be infinitely patient. You are not required to absorb the cost of someone else's developmental timeline indefinitely. Compassion for the avoidance history and genuine understanding of why initiation is difficult for them does not obligate you to remain in a dynamic that is consistently failing to meet your needs while you wait for the work to produce results. What you are doing, the shifting of your own patterns, the building of the conditions, the genuine reorientation toward your own fullness rather than their responsiveness, is work that benefits you regardless of the outcome. It makes you a better communicator, a more grounded partner, a person whose relational presence is cleaner and more powerful than it was when the dynamic was running on the fuel of your anxiety. That work is yours to keep, whether or not this particular avoidant ever fully meets you in it. And sometimes, in the course of doing that work, in the course of genuinely shifting your relationship to the outcome, and building the internal foundation that makes the communication style described throughout this conversation natural rather than effortful, you will find that the question of whether this specific avoidant initiates begins to feel less urgent than you expected. Not because the wanting has gone, not because the connection has become less significant, but because your own life, reoriented toward itself rather than toward the monitoring of another person's patterns, has become compelling enough to hold most of your attention on its own terms. And in that space, in the genuine unperformed fullness of a person who has come back to themselves, two things become possible that were not possible before. The avoidant, encountering the new version of the dynamic, may find the conditions finally right for the initiation that the old dynamic made impossible. Or you, living from the fullness of genuine self-reclamation, may find with surprising clarity that the relationship either works now, in this new configuration, or it does not. And that either outcome, however difficult, is something you can navigate. Because you are not the person who was waiting anymore. You are the person who is living. And the living, as it turns out, was always the answer. Not the technique, not the strategy, not the careful construction of conditions designed to produce a specific behavior in another person. The genuine, full-throated, unapologetic commitment to your own life as something worth showing up for completely, every day, in every room, in every conversation, with or without the validation of someone whose initiation you were waiting for. That commitment is what changes dynamics. What shifts calculations? What makes the impossible feel? To a nervous system that was always scanning for proof that closeness is survivable, like something worth risking, because the person in front of them is not waiting for the risk to pay off. They are already living the return, already inhabiting the life that the risk, if taken, would let them enter. That is the invitation that an avoidant finally answers. Not the one delivered in words, or waiting, or the patient, generous, quietly exhausting hope of someone who has been reaching for too long. The one delivered in the quality of a life being fully, visibly, genuinely lived. The one that says, without saying anything at all, that there is something remarkable happening over here, and the door is open, and no one is waiting, and the only question is whether you are going to walk through it, or spend the rest of your life standing at the threshold of the best thing you never let yourself have. That question is theirs to answer, and your life, full, moving, already underway, does not pause while they decide. The decision is theirs, it always was, And one of the most liberating realizations available to someone who has spent significant time and emotional energy trying to create the conditions for an avoidant to finally show up fully is the moment that truth lands not as defeat, but as relief. The moment you stop carrying the weight of their becoming as though it belongs to you. The moment the question of whether they will initiate, whether they will lead, whether they will finally cross the threshold from passive participant to active, self-directed partner stops being the organizing question of your emotional life. Because here is what that question costs you while it remains central. It costs you the present tense. Every moment spent monitoring whether they are moving towards you is a moment not spent moving toward your own life. Every unit of attention allocated to decoding their behavior is a unit unavailable for building something that belongs entirely to you. Every morning that begins with the low hum of wondering whether today is the day they finally reach first is a morning whose first emotional act is organized around someone else rather than around yourself. And that reallocation of your own attention, chronic, habitual, so normalized that you may not even notice it happening anymore, is one of the quietest and most significant costs of the dynamic. Not the dramatic cost of the withdrawals and the silences and the charged unresolved moments of almost and not quite. The daily, incremental, nearly invisible cost of a life lived in the periphery of someone else's patterns, rather than at the center of your own. Reclaiming the center is not a single event. It is not a decision made once that holds permanently without maintenance. It is a practice in the most unglamorous sense of that word, a daily returning, a repeated choosing of your own interior as the primary residence, rather than the place you occasionally visit between sessions of monitoring the dynamic. And it is harder than it sounds, because the grooves carved by months or years of the other orientation run deep. The habit of checking, interpreting, adjusting, of reading the relational weather and responding to it before you have even checked in with your own, does not dissolve because you understand it. It fades through the repetition of a different choice. Through catching the outward reach of attention and redirecting it inward, not with force or judgment, but with the patient consistency of someone who is building a new habit on top of an old one. What this practice produces, over time, is something that has a specific and recognizable effect on every dynamic you inhabit, including, and perhaps especially, the one with the avoidant. It produces gravity, not the performed gravity of someone who has read that appearing less available makes you more attractive. The actual gravity of a person whose inner world has enough substance and momentum that it exerts a genuine pull on the people around them. The kind of gravity that is not about being mysterious or withholding or strategically hard to reach. It is about being so genuinely present in your own life, so actually interested in your own becoming, so authentically engaged with your own questions and projects, and developing sense of what matters. That being around you feels like being near something real, something that has weight, something that does not shift and adjust and reconfigure itself according to the needs of the room. This quality is rare, and avoidants whose nervous systems are exquisitely attuned to the difference between people who are genuinely themselves and people who are performing a version of themselves calibrated for relational effect, feel it immediately. They may not name it, they may not be able to articulate why the interactions with you have begun to feel different from what they are accustomed to. But they feel the gravity. They notice that the conversations leave them thinking rather than managing. That your presence generates something in them that is less like the activation of a familiar fear and more like the activation of a genuine, undefended interest. And genuine, undefended interest in an avoidant who has spent their relational life behind walls is the closest thing available to the conditions required for real initiation. For the reaching that comes not from urgency or crisis, or the ignited passion of potential loss, but from the quiet, considered, freely chosen impulse of someone who simply wants more of something good. Who has enough evidence, accumulated through enough interactions, that going toward this person produces something worth going toward? There is a specific quality that develops in your communication when the gravity is real, when the centering of your own life is genuine rather than strategic. And it is the quality that tends to be the final piece of what makes avoidant initiation shift from occasional and tentative to something more consistent and self-assured. It is the quality of not needing the conversation to go anywhere in particular. Most interactions in dynamics where one person is waiting for the other to step up carry a destination quality, a sense of somewhere they are trying to arrive. Whether it is more closeness or more clarity, or more evidence of the other person's investment, the conversation is being steered, however subtly, towards something. And the avoidant feels the steering. Their nervous system, which is always reading the subtext of the interaction rather than just its surface content, registers the directionality, the sense of being moved toward a particular outcome. And that registration activates the familiar response, the bracing, the subtle pulling back, the internal preparation for the moment when the destination becomes explicit, and the pressure to respond to it becomes unavoidable. When you are genuinely unattached to where the conversation goes, when you are in it for the quality of the exchange itself, rather than for what the exchange might produce, or confirm, or advance, the directionality disappears. The interaction becomes, in the most genuinely rare relational sense, simply itself. Two people talking because the talking is interesting. Two people in the same space because the space is enjoyable. Two people sharing because sharing produces something real, and neither of them needs it to produce something beyond that. In that quality of interaction, the avoidant scanning finds nothing to brace against. The threat that their nervous system is perpetually looking for does not arrive. And in its absence, something unfamiliar occupies the space. The simple, uncomplicated pleasure of being in a connection that does not ask anything of them beyond their genuine presence. And that pleasure, modest, undramatic, entirely sustainable, is the feeling they find themselves wanting to return to, that they find themselves, for once, moving toward rather than away from. This is where initiation is born, not in the dramatic moments, not in the charged, urgent, everything on the line interactions that produce the explosion of feeling, but not the sustained behavior change. In the ordinary, repeated, quietly enjoyable interactions that build a felt sense of this is good and I want more of it, that eventually becomes louder than the fear of what more costs. The avoidant who begins to initiate consistently is not the avoidant who was finally cornered by the right circumstances into action. They are the avoidant whose internal calculation, finally, through accumulated evidence, through the persistent delivery of interactions that fail to confirm the fear, through the gradually increasing weight of what not reaching costs against the gradually decreasing weight of what reaching costs, shifted. Whose nervous system updated its model, whose history was supplemented by enough new data to create a different default response. That shift is not guaranteed. It requires their own willingness alongside everything you bring to the dynamic. Their own honest engagement with the work of understanding what the filter costs them, what the non-initiation takes from the connections they actually value, what version of their relational life they are building through the repeated choice to hold back. Some avoidants make that engagement. Some find, in the experience of nearly losing something genuinely significant, the motivation to look honestly at the patterns and begin the slow work of changing them. Others do not, and knowing the difference, being able to see clearly, without the distortion of hope, whether the person in front of you is someone who is moving, however slowly, toward genuine change, or someone who is cycling through the familiar patterns with sufficient surface variation to make the cycling look like progress, is one of the most important capacities you can develop. The signs of genuine movement are specific and worth naming. They are not the dramatic declarations of intent that feel significant in the moment and evaporate under ordinary conditions. They are quieter and more durable than that. They are the small, consistent behavioral evidence of someone whose internal relationship to initiation is actually shifting rather than being temporarily overridden by the urgency of a particular circumstance. Genuine movement looks like initiation that does not require a crisis to produce it. Reaching that happens on an ordinary day when nothing is at stake except the simple chosen act of closing a distance they could have left open. Contact that arrives not because the silence became threatening, but because they thought of you and the thought prompted action without the filter successfully intercepting it. These moments are unspectacular. They do not arrive with fanfare or emotional weight, or the particular charged quality of avoidant opening under pressure. They arrive simply, quietly, as the ordinary behavior of someone for whom going first is becoming, incrementally and against significant historical resistance, a little less impossible. These moments are worth noticing, worth receiving with the warmth that genuine appreciation delivers, without the weight of expectation attached. Worth acknowledging internally as evidence of something real moving in a real direction, however slowly, however imperfectly, because they are the actual substance of change, the unremarkable, undramatic daily evidence that the architecture is shifting, that the walls, built over years and maintained through the perpetual reinforcement of fear, are developing in the specific place where your consistent presence and your genuine fullness and your undemanding appreciation have been meeting them. The first signs of something that was not there before. Not an opening yet. Not the full, unguarded, freely chosen vulnerability that healthy initiation ultimately looks like. Something earlier than that. Something more tentative and more significant simultaneously. The cracks that precede the opening, the first evidence that the wall, however solid it has always appeared, is not after all impervious to the particular, patient, entirely genuine force of being consistently met by someone who required nothing from the meeting except the meeting itself. That is what you brought. That is what this was always about. Not a technique applied to a problem. A person showing up fully to a connection, and in the fullness of that showing up, creating the only conditions under which a defended, fearful, genuinely feeling human being can finally, tentatively begin to believe that going first might not destroy them. It might in fact be the beginning of the only thing they have always actually wanted, to be in something real, with someone real, who sees them clearly and stays anyway, who does not need them to be different, only to be honest, who is so thoroughly, unshakably themselves that being close to them feels like the safest and most alive place the avoidant has ever stood. Worth initiating toward. Worth leading into. Worth, finally, and at significant personal cost, and against the full weight of everything their history taught them about what love costs, worth choosing, clearly, actively, without the hedge of managed distance or the safety net of waiting for the other person to go first. Worth all of it. And you, the person who held the space, who built the conditions, who refused to collapse into either desperate pursuit or punishing withdrawal, who stayed genuinely, fully, unperformably yourself throughout. You were always the reason the worth became visible to them. Not because you were waiting for them to see it, because you already knew it. And knowing it, living it, communicating it through every unforced and undemanding and genuinely present interaction. That knowing was the most powerful thing in the room. The whole time. Even when it felt like nothing was happening. Even when the silence suggested otherwise. Even when the filter was winning and the initiation was not coming, and the gap between what you needed and what was being offered felt insurmountable. Underneath all of it, something was accumulating. Something that does not announce itself while it is building. Something that looks from the outside like nothing much, right up until the moment it becomes everything. The moment they reach first. Not because they had to, because they finally, freely chose to.